Amara Hayes, a quiet black girl wrongly expelled by a racist principal, rose from the ashes of injustice to become the voice of change. Her battle wasn't just against one man, it was against a system that tried to erase her. Now, her story is a beacon of resilience for every silent soul. If you believe in the power of standing up, subscribe and hit like to support stories of strength that inspire change. Rain whispered against the rusted windowpanes of Rosewood High, the kind of rain that made the sky look bruised and the ground shimmer like oil-slick tears. Inside, the silence of the hallways was pierced only by the soft tap of Amara Hayes' sneakers as she walked with her head down, backpack clutched to her chest like a shield. She was quiet, always had been, her voice a tender violin in a room full of drums, but her silence held stories, deep as rivers, layered like ash over fire. She didn't speak much, but when she looked at you, it was like she was reading something behind your eyes you didn't know was there. Her skin was the kind of deep black that held light, not absorbed it, like onyx under moonlight, and her presence, though she never tried to command it, shifted the air. But Principal Richard Ellison didn't see that. All he saw was a quiet black girl, easy to ignore, easy to blame. So when someone graffitied a slur across the side of the chemistry lab, "Dumb bitch Ms. Lang deserves to die," in shaky black marker, Ellison didn't even hesitate. No investigation. No due process. Just a single security camera image, distorted by rain, showing a girl in a hoodie roughly Amara's height walking down the science wing. That was all he needed. The next morning, he summoned her to his office, his mouth thin with something smug and cruel. The blinds were drawn, casting long shadows across the carpet like prison bars. "You know why you're here," he said, not even looking at her. She tried to speak, confusion flooding her voice, but he cut her off. "Don't play dumb. You're expelled. Effective immediately." And just like that, her world unraveled. Her friends, few and tentative, scattered like birds startled from a branch. Teachers avoided her eyes. Her locker was cleared out and dumped into a black trash bag. On the way home, she sat at the back of the bus, face turned to the window, watching the rain streak down like the world was crying with her. She didn't cry though. Not yet. Her mother, Dr. Nadine Hayes, found her curled on the couch, still in her soaked hoodie, eyes dull and distant like a fire bank starved of oxygen. Nadine didn't ask what happened. She just sat beside her daughter, took her hand, and said quietly, "Tell me everything." What followed was silence. Then words, like stones falling from a ledge. And as Amara spoke, Nadine's face shifted, not in shock, but in something colder, sharper. Because just 3 weeks prior, she had accepted the unanimous appointment to become the new president of the Rosewood County School Board. Principal Ellison didn't know. Not yet. And when he would find out, it would already be too late. That night, Nadine didn't sleep. She sat at the dining table with legal files spread out like a general preparing for war. She made calls. Quiet ones. To lawyers, to reporters, to civil rights organizations. She pulled up school policy documents, security footage access logs, incident reports. She didn't raise her voice, but her stillness was thunder waiting to break. And across the town, under street lamps and behind shuttered windows, people started to whisper about the quiet girl, the brilliant woman who raised her, and the reckoning that might finally be coming to Rosewood High. The next morning, Principal Ellison sipped his coffee like he did every day, smug in his certainty that Amara was gone and forgotten. Until the email came. Then the call. Then the knock on his door. A school board emergency meeting. Mandatory. The kind that sent shivers through the corridors of bureaucracy. In the boardroom, he walked in with the same arrogance he wore like a tailored suit until he saw her. Nadine Hayes. Sitting at the head of the table, calm and unreadable, her eyes on him like a scalpel in the hand of a surgeon. "Good morning, Mr. Ellison," she said, voice smooth and deadly quiet. "Shall we begin?" Cameras were there. Reporters too. And when the footage played, another angle, from the maintenance corridor Ellison had conveniently overlooked, it showed a completely different figure from the back. Shorter, lighter skin, a different walk. Not Amara. Not even close. The silence that followed was the kind that breaks bones. Ellison stammered, tried to explain. Nadine didn't let him. "You expelled my daughter without evidence," she said. "You failed in your duty to protect her rights. You made her a scapegoat." He tried to interrupt. She raised a hand. "And now, you are suspended pending an internal investigation. Effective immediately." As security escorted him from the room, the reporters surged forward. The boardroom erupted, and Amara, sitting in the back with her hands clenched on her knees, watched it all with wide, disbelieving eyes. But that was just the beginning, because Nadine wasn't interested in vindication. She wanted transformation. That week, she announced a sweeping reform of Rosewood High's disciplinary policies. Implicit bias training became mandatory. A review board was formed for all suspensions and expulsions. And Amara? She became the symbol of it all. Invitations came in, from newspapers, from community groups, even from state legislators. People wanted to hear her story. And slowly, carefully, Amara began to speak. Her voice, once hidden in the margins, found its volume. She spoke at town halls, her words quiet but sharp, unraveling systemic injustice with the grace of a poet and the fury of the silenced. Her story lit fires. But not everyone was pleased. There were those who muttered in corners, who said she was making too much of it, stirring things that should be left alone. But Amara kept going. Because she had learned something. Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, waits, watches, and then strikes like lightning across a darkened sky. And still, the rain kept falling. Cleansing. Baptizing. Becoming the rhythm to which a revolution might one day rise. The whispers turned into waves, crashing against the quiet corners of Rosewood like wine through tall grass, everywhere and nowhere, unstoppable in their spread. Amara walked the halls of Rosewood High again, for the first time since her expulsion, not as a student cast in shadow, but as a returning storm cloaked in calm. The building looked the same, beige cinderblock walls, flickering fluorescent lights, water-damaged ceiling tiles, but the air had changed. Students parted in her path like the tide around stone, some with awe, others with unease, all of them watching as though she were something wholly returned from exile. Her locker stood empty, freshly painted, the vandalized wall in the science wing now scrubbed and bleached until the ghost of the slur had faded into pale smears, but she remembered where every letter once screamed. Ms. Lang, the teacher whose name had been scrawled with hatred, met her eyes for the first time in weeks and offered a tight, embarrassed nod. Amara didn't smile. She didn't need to. There was a power now in her silence, no longer mistaken for weakness but recognized as a gathering storm, a coiled force. Outside of school, the story spiraled. News vans parked on corners, their satellite dishes pointed at the sky like hungry mouths. Reporters dug into Ellison's history and unearthed a pattern. Students of color disproportionately punished, ignored complaints from parents, misfiled reports. He had skated under the radar for years, hiding behind charm, bureaucracy, and the complacency of a town that liked its ugliness politely veiled. But no longer. Nadine had pulled the veil away with surgical precision, and what lay beneath was rot. The community, once divided in whispered loyalties, began to crack. Some parents demanded his reinstatement, claiming he was just doing his job, while others stood with Nadine and Amara, carrying signs that read, "Our children deserve justice," and "Silence isn't safety." The divide ran like a fault line through dinner tables, classrooms, and staff lounges. Meanwhile, Amara's life shifted with a strange and haunting gravity. She became the face of something larger than herself, and it both terrified and empowered her. Her room filled with letters, some kind, some venomous. A white envelope slid under the door one night read simply, "You should have stayed quiet." Nadine found it first. She burned it without a word. Amara saw the ashes swirling in the fireplace, like scorched feathers. Nadine didn't allow fear into the house. Only strategy. Only action. She hired a security detail. She held town forums. She didn't blink. At night, Amara would lie in bed, the world too loud in her ears, and trace the cracks in her ceiling, imagining them as roads leading to something bigger than the town that tried to break her. Then came the lawsuit. Nadine filed it with the kind of elegant fury only a mother who had watched her daughter be unjustly destroyed could summon. Not just against Ellison, but against the district for systemic negligence. It wasn't about money. It was about a message carved deep into the foundation of an institution that had failed. Amara didn't want pity. She wanted change. She wanted names remembered, not forgotten. She wanted it so no other girl who looked like her, soft-spoken and dark-skinned, would ever be erased because someone decided she was easy to silence. The trial hearings were public. The courtroom felt like a cathedral built of tension and cold air. Amara took the stand. Her voice was steady, her eyes fixed on some point beyond the jury. "I was quiet," she said, "but I was never invisible. You just never looked." Ellison sat across from her, his face a ruin of arrogance and confusion, as if he couldn't reconcile the girl he'd expelled with the force now standing against him. Witnesses testified, teachers who had noticed but stayed silent, students who remembered more than they let on. The gavel came down like thunder after weeks of testimony. The verdict was swift. Ellison was found guilty of misconduct and discriminatory behavior. The district was ordered to pay damages and to enact sweeping reforms. But that wasn't the end. It was never about one man. It was about the mirror his actions held up to a town, a school, a system. Rosewood was changing now, not easily, not gently. Protests became policy. Students formed committees. Nadine launched a local watchdog group. Amara began speaking at schools across the state. Her voice, once hidden beneath layers of fear and silence, carried through auditoriums with a quiet that demanded attention. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her presence was a storm cloud over fields long left fallow, promising rain and reckoning. In private, though, the weight of it all lingered. At night, she still flinched at loud knocks. She still remembered the way people had looked at her in those days, after the expulsion, like she was a stain. Trauma doesn't vanish with justice. It coils into your bones and hums there. But she carried it like a crown, forged in fire. And as the seasons shifted, and the rain that once washed the lies from the walls of Rosewood turned to snow, Amara stood at the threshold of something vast. Colleges wrote to her. Documentarians requested interviews. Artists painted murals of her face on city walls. A poet from Atlanta called her the echo of every girl they tried to silence and failed. And still she walked through the world softly. Not out of fear, but because she had learned that silence is not the absence of power. It is its breath, its pause, the moment before the wave crashes, the hush before the sky splits open. Amara's life, once confined to the dusty corners of a high school corridor, had unfolded into something much wider than she could have ever imagined in those quiet days when she kept her head low, when the world seemed like a canvas too large to touch. But now, she was the center of something impossible to ignore, not just in Rosewood, but across the state. Her face was on the front page of the local paper more often than the weather forecast, her name whispered through hallways and office halls, a symbol of both defiance and hope. But still, the smallness of her world clung to her in moments when the noise grew too loud. There were nights when she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching, waiting, as though her past might be a shadow that would always stretch just beyond her reach. She learned, too, that the weight of victory comes with a price. She wasn't just the girl who had fought back against injustice. She was the embodiment of change, and that made her both a beacon and a target. The long nights with her mother, the quiet talks by the fire, where Nadine's hands would move in deliberate gestures as she mapped out strategies to protect her daughter, left Amara with an understanding of the power and sacrifice her mother had built her life on. Nadine, always graceful, always meticulous, had taught her that strength was not an explosion of force but a quiet, steady persistence, a ripple that turns into a wave, not by sheer power, but by the delicate, consistent motion of it. They never spoke about the darker parts of the journey, those moments of silence before they had struck back, those moments when they felt as though they were standing in the eye of a storm, but Amara felt them. She could feel the tightness in her mother's jaw sometimes, that tightness that spoke of things that couldn't be undone, battles fought that left wounds unhealed, scars beneath the skin. Rosewood, the town that had watched her fall, now stood under the weight of their scrutiny. The people who once turned their backs on her now watched with hungry eyes, curious to see whether she would remain standing once the dust of victory settled. Nadine's reforms weren't just policies, they were a rebellion, a reweaving of the fabric of the system itself. And yet, in those hours when the world was asleep, when all the battles were fought and won in public, Amara found herself alone, haunted by the faces of the teachers who had whispered against her and the classmates who had turned away. But the past was a murky river, and she knew, in her bones, that it was only in forward motion that she would find the place where peace could be restored. When Amara returned to Rosewood High, it wasn't the same as before. She stood taller, more aware of the eyes that followed her, but there was a new kind of calm in her. She no longer needed to be seen by everyone, didn't require the validation of peers who had turned away in her darkest hours. Now, her silence was a choice, one of self-possession, not of fear. The school district, transformed under the weight of Nadine's push for accountability, began to feel different, like a ship righting itself after a storm. More teachers started coming forward, sharing their experiences of being pressured to turn a blind eye, of watching students suffer in ways they could not ignore but had felt powerless to stop. They began to speak up. It was no longer safe to be complicit. Students who had been afraid to speak out began to find their voices. The quiet ones, the ones like Amara, who had learned early that silence could be a shield, were now standing taller. But it wasn't just the walls of Rosewood High that were shifting. It was the very air around her. People who had once whispered her name in disapproval now asked for her perspective. Leaders in the community, politicians, business owners, even other educators, began to listen in ways they never had before. The respect she had earned didn't come from her outward defiance. It came from her integrity, from the way she had borne the weight of it all without collapsing. They all thought they knew her, but Amara had never let anyone in. The quiet girl who had once hidden her brilliance under the guise of meekness was gone. She had transformed, in ways they couldn't have foreseen, into something they didn't know how to label. Yet still, there were moments when the loneliness of it all would reach her. Even surrounded by people who revered her, who called her a hero, there were hours when she would find herself standing alone in front of a mirror, wondering who she had become. It was in these moments, when the world outside blurred and the echoes of past doubts crept in, that she would hear the soft voice of her mother in her mind, reminding her that it was not about being perfect. It was about being real, about standing, even when the world feels like it's crumbling at your feet. But it wasn't just her mother's voice that guided her, it was something deeper, something older. Her ancestors had been the ones who survived where others fell. They had fought, had worked, had loved even when love felt like a foreign currency. The weight of their legacy was heavy on her shoulders, but it was also a cloak, one that wrapped her in strength when she needed it most. No one could take that from her. No one could erase the story of who she was. And in the mornings, when she stepped out into the light, she felt the world shift again. It wasn't just the echoes of her own battle that filled the streets. It was the battle of every quiet person who had ever been silenced, every voice that had been hushed under the weight of someone else's power. She didn't have to carry it all on her own, but she knew she would stand at the forefront of it. Her voice, her silence, everything she was was part of the wave now. The story continued to spread, a ripple that turned into a current. She would go to the rallies, the marches, the meetings, never allowing herself to forget where it all began. Her fight, her mother's fight, was not over. It was only just beginning. The changes at Rosewood High were just the first steps of what had to be a long and hard climb. But Amara knew that change had already been set into motion. What had once been a quiet injustice was now an undeniable roar that filled the streets, the town, the schools. And as long as there were people like her, the ones who had been overlooked, the ones who had been buried under assumptions, there would always be a way to rise. The world was changing, because it had to. It was just a matter of how long they would fight to keep the light from breaking through. Amara stood on the edge of the life she had rebuilt, her fingers brushing against the cool, metallic surface of the podium that had become a symbol of her strength. In front of her, an auditorium full of faces, some familiar, others new, sat in quiet anticipation. The air was thick with the weight of history, of a town that had once rejected her, now standing before her in reverence. The lights above flickered, casting an ethereal glow over her as she took a breath, steadying herself before she spoke. Her voice, once a whisper lost in the din, now rang with the power of something far deeper. "We don't get to choose the moments that break us," she began, her eyes scanning the sea of faces before her. "But we do get to choose how we rise from them." The crowd hung on every word, their silence punctuating each sentence like a pulse. Amara had come to understand that silence was not weakness. It was the stillness before the storm, the quiet hum of a rising power that needed no explanation. And now, she was that storm. She hadn't asked for the world to notice her. She hadn't asked for the battles that had shaped her. But she had fought, not for the applause or the accolades, but because she had been wronged, because her dignity had been taken and her voice had been stolen, and she had risen not to seek revenge, but to ensure that no one else would face what she had. What had once been a fight for herself had become a fight for every person who had ever felt invisible, every person who had been crushed under the weight of someone else's indifference. The journey had not been easy. It had torn at her, unraveling pieces of herself she had never known were there. But it had also stitched something new into the fabric of her soul, something unbreakable. She had learned that true power did not come from standing alone. It came from standing together, from sharing your truth, from refusing to allow injustice to hide in the shadows. The world was watching, but the world had always been watching, even when she hadn't known it. Amara had learned how to carry herself through the noise, to see beyond the clamor and chaos, and to understand that her story was no longer hers alone. It was the story of every person who had ever been forced to endure, to be silenced, to be ignored. The fight that had begun in the hallways of Rosewood High had grown into something larger, something that reached far beyond the walls of the school. It had seeped into the very bones of the town, rattling the foundation of a system that had been built on complacency. Amara had become the symbol of something larger than herself, the embodiment of a change that was inevitable, a change that could no longer be denied. But even in the face of victory, there were moments when doubt crept in. There were still people who would never understand, people who would never see the value in her fight. There were still whispers in corners, still glances exchanged in the hallways, as if her presence could never be fully accepted. And yet, Amara had learned to move past those things. She had learned that the world would not always be fair, and that sometimes, the only thing you could control was how you responded to it. She had learned to rise, time and time again, even when it felt like the weight of the world was too much to bear. Nadine stood beside her now, as always, a constant presence in her life, a reminder of the strength that ran through their family. Together, they had built something that was not just a defense against injustice, but a beacon of what could be. It was a light in the dark, a promise that the future could be different. Nadine's work on the school board was far from over. The policies they had put into place were only the beginning. They had shaken the foundations, but the work of rebuilding was slow, painstaking. It required patience, perseverance, And above all, an unwavering belief that change was possible, even when it seemed impossible. Amara had come to understand that the battle for justice would never be over. There would always be more to fight for, more to change, more to uncover. But that was not something that scared her anymore. It was something that empowered her. The world would try to break her, to bend her, to silence her, but she had learned that her silence was not something that could be forced. It was hers to give, hers to keep. And now, with her mother by her side, and a community that had finally begun to understand, Amara was ready to take the next step. It was time for her to leave Rosewood. The town had been the place where her battle had started, but it was not the place where her future would unfold. She had fought for change, for justice, for a world where people like her would no longer be dismissed or ignored. But now, the world was calling her beyond the walls of this small town. There were universities eager to have her, to help her grow into the force she was destined to become. There were activists who wanted her voice in the halls of power, to help guide them in the fight for justice on a larger scale. And there was a world beyond Rosewood that needed the quiet strength she had learned to carry. As she packed her things, as she prepared to leave behind the place that had both broken her and helped her become whole again, Amara felt a strange sense of peace. She wasn't running away. She was walking towards something. Something bigger, something more important. It was the next step in the journey that had begun so long ago, when a false accusation had shattered her life and set her on a path she had never expected. But now she knew she was ready. Ready to face whatever came next. Ready to take the lessons she had learned and use them to build a future that would stand as a testament to the power of resilience, of family, of community. Rosewood had tried to break her, but it had only made her stronger. And now, as she stepped into the future, she would carry that strength with her. She was no longer just Amara Hayes, the quiet girl who had been expelled. She was Amara Hayes, the daughter of a woman who had fought for what was right. She was the face of change. And she was just getting started. As the door to her room clicked shut behind her, Amara turned one last time to look at the life she was leaving behind. She had come full circle, from the shadows of silence to the light of truth. And as she walked away, she knew that she would never be invisible again. Amara's departure from Rosewood was not the end of her journey, but a beginning, a new chapter in a story that had been written in the ink of resilience, the blood of those who came before her, and the fire of those who had believed in her, even when the world seemed intent on denying her existence. The day she left was heavy with quiet anticipation, as if the whole town held its breath, unsure of what her leaving would mean. It was a departure full of ghosts, both the ones that had shaped her and the ones she was leaving behind. Nadine was there, of course, always steady, always constant, her presence both a grounding force and a beacon of the power Amara had inherited. "You've already changed the world, baby," Nadine whispered as they packed the last of Amara's things into the trunk of their car. The trunk closed with a finality that echoed in the stillness around them. Amara nodded but didn't speak. There was too much to say, and not enough words in the world to capture it. The car hummed to life, the tires biting into the gravel, rolling away from Rosewood, leaving the school behind, leaving the fight behind, but not really. Her story was no longer tethered to one place, no longer bound by the walls of a building that had tried to swallow her whole. It had become a part of something larger, something that stretched far beyond the limits of this small town. She had once been a child who looked at the world as if it were too big to touch, but now, the world felt small beneath her feet, like a landscape she was destined to reshape. Nadine drove in silence, her hands firm on the wheel, her eyes forward, always focused on the road ahead. She had been a soldier in this battle for so long, a warrior who had fought not just for her daughter, but for every mother who had been silenced, for every child who had been overlooked. She had seen the world burn and rebuild itself, and now, as the horizon stretched before them, it felt like they were both standing on the edge of something profound. Amara felt the weight of it, the weight of all she had endured, of the people she had lost, of the injustices that had come before her. But in that weight, there was a strange lightness, a freedom that came with knowing that she had finally spoken, had finally been heard. The road stretched ahead, long and winding, but it was a road that she had chosen. And as the miles clicked by, a thought began to settle in her chest, quiet at first, but growing with each passing mile. She was not done yet. She wasn't done, because the battle for justice was never over. It was a fight that had no clear endpoint, no single victory to be claimed. It was a continuous force, a constant tug and pull between the forces of oppression and the strength of those who refused to bow to it. Her story had become the seed of something larger, an idea, a movement that could not be stifled by any one person, by any one institution. It lived in the hearts of those who had once felt invisible. It was in the breath of every quiet girl who had been overlooked, every boy who had been told he was nothing. And it was in Amara now, alive and pulsing, ready to spread beyond the walls of Rosewood, beyond the walls of any town that had ever tried to silence the voices of its children. The next few years were a blur, a series of moments that stretched out before her like a constellation of events, each one pulling her towards something greater. She moved through the world like a force of nature, quiet but undeniable. She began speaking at rallies, at universities, at conferences where people sought her out, eager to hear the story of the girl who had fought back. Her words, once soft, now carried the weight of experience, of knowing exactly what it felt like to stand at the edge of everything, to be rejected, to be broken, and yet to rise, unbowed. Her name became synonymous with change, with the fight for justice. But it was not just her name that mattered. It was the countless others who stood beside her, the ones who had been overlooked, who had never been given the opportunity to speak. It was the faces of the girls in the front row at every event, the ones who looked at her like they had finally found a place where their voices could be heard, where their stories were not just tolerated, but celebrated. Her rise had been her own, but it was not hers alone. And though she had become the face of something larger, there was always a part of her that remembered the quiet spaces, the corners where no one looked, where no one cared. She carried those spaces with her, held them close, so that she could always remember where she had come from. Nadine continued her work on the school board, pushing for more systemic changes, but now there was a new urgency in her voice, a new fire that had been lit by the struggle Amara had endured. They worked together, side by side, creating spaces where young voices could be heard, where no one would ever be silenced again. It was slow, painstaking work, but it was the work that had to be done. There were still moments of doubt. There were still days when Amara woke up to the echoes of her past, when the weight of everything she had fought for seemed unbearable. But she had learned that doubt was not a sign of weakness. It was the mark of someone who had lived, who had struggled, who had survived. And surviving, she had learned, was not just about getting through. It was about taking the broken pieces of yourself and building something new. When the first major victory came, a bill passed through state legislation that mandated better training for teachers in recognizing systemic bias. Amara stood in front of the assembly, not as a witness, but as a participant. Her hands, once trembling, now held the pen that signed her name into history. Her story had become part of something much larger than herself. She had become a bridge, a path that others could follow, and she knew that this was just the beginning. The weight of it all had not broken her. It had forged her into something greater. And as she stood there, feeling the weight of the future on her shoulders, Amara knew she was ready. Ready to face the challenges that would come, ready to walk the path she had carved, not just for herself, but for every quiet person who had ever been overlooked. The story of Amara Hayes, the girl who had been silenced, had become the story of a community that had risen, of a world that had been forced to reckon with its own injustices. But it was more than that. It was a story of resilience, of strength that came from the quietest places, of a girl who had refused to be erased. And as the years passed, as Amara's name continued to be spoken in halls of power, in classrooms, in homes, she carried with her the knowledge that the fight was never over. But she was no longer the quiet girl. she was the storm. And the world, at last, had no choice but to listen.